Topic for panel one is SOF Support to Resilience and Resistance across the 4 ages of SOF. Moderating the panel is Dr. Scott Smitson from JSOU. Scott is a PhD, retired Army strategist who most recently served in U.S. Southern Command. You've probably seen him on previous fora as an expert on South America and great power competition. Now he's at JSOU, but previously served in the Joint Staff J8, responsible for overseeing numerous efforts related to global integration, and was director of the Chairman's Net Assessment on Iran. He has an extensive bio, which I encourage you to look at in your program, but he is also the co-author with Dr. Wilson on a parameters essay on a compound security dilemma. So the ideal moderator for our first panel. So Scott, we're looking forward to your panel's comments.
Good morning, sir. Thank you so very much for that kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to panel one, SOF Support to Resilience and Resistance across the 4 ages of SOF. We're very, very fortunate today to have 3 extremely qualified and experienced SOF professionals that represent decades of experience within the SOF community across the totality of the mission sets and the kind of challenges and threats that Dr. Wilson briefly went over in his opening remarks. What I'd like to do today is briefly introduce our 3 panelists and then turn it over to the panelists for their views on both the continuity and change in resilience and resistance and really thinking about these things from a multidimensional perspective. So we have 3 great panelists that are with us today. Dr. Otto Fiala is the task lead analyst and editor of the Sensitive Activities Research and Development Team at U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and is also a research associate at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. He's the author of the recent publication titled Resistance Resurgent, Resurrecting a Method of Irregular Warfare and Great Power Competition. He also was the Resistance and Resilience Planner at Special Operations Command Europe, and is the author and chief editor of the Resilience Operating Concept. He served as the senior counterintelligence analyst at USUCOM J2, as well as at US AFRICOM's Joint Doctrine Coordinator. Dr. Fiala has served in the Army's active component, National Guard, and Reserve as an infantry officer, as well as a civil affairs officer, and is deployed to Iraq, Georgia, and commanded from all ranks from captain up through to including colonel. He holds a doctorate in international relations and a Juris Doctorate, as well as a Bachelor's of Arts in political science and economics. Dr. Liam Collins is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel who's conducted operational deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, across Latin America, the Horn of Africa, and Bosnia. He was the founding director of the Modern War Institute at West Point and the former director of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, as well as a fellow at New America and a permanent member, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Liam's work has been cited by the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, the White House Press Secretary, and his works has appeared in the New York Times, the Associated Press, CNN, ABC and Fox News, NPR, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Liam is the co-editor of the Rutledge Handbook of U.S. Counterterrorism and Irregular Warfare Operations and holds a PhD at Princeton University. Finally, we're also blessed to have with us today Master Chief Jim Boehmer. Master Chief Boehmer is the SOCOM J5's Command Senior Enlisted Leader. Master Chief Boehmer has served in a wide variety of assignments within the SEAL Team community, to include SEAL Team 4, instructor as the Naval Special Warfare Center Detachment platoon leading petty officer, as well as service with SEAL Team 8, SEAL Team 2, the Joint Staff Integrated Vulnerability Assessment Team at DITRA, as well as serving as the Command Master Chief at SEAL Team 8. Some of his other assignments have included time as the Naval Special Warfare Group 2, where he was the Operations Master Chief Senior Enlisted Advisor to Naval Special Warfare Unit 10, as well as Special Operations Command East Africa. He was the Command Senior Enlisted Leader for Special Operations Command Korea, and prior to coming to SOCOM, was the SOCPAC Senior Enlisted Leader prior to his current assignment. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today. Dr. Fiala, the floor is yours.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the ages of SOF and their impact on resilience and resistance, but particularly resistance. And then I'm going to talk about the ROC concept of resistance. Next slide, please. All right, that's just the agenda that I'm going to go through. We're going to talk about irregular warfare, adversaries, resistance, and resilience. Next slide. Okay, the first stage. The first stage of SOF was 41 to 60, and the basis was laid by the Office of Strategic Services at World War II. They laid the foundation for what we understand as unconventional warfare. The next bullet, we've got Lieutenant Colonel Russell Volkman. Lieutenant Colonel Russell Volkman did not surrender to the Japanese in the Philippines, but rather went ahead into the hinterland, joined up with Filipino resistance forces, and conducted operations against the Japanese. That's important because Russell Volkman laid the foundation for what we understand as unconventional warfare by either writing or having influence on initial doctrine on guerrilla and counter-guerrilla operations. The third bullet, we've got the Jedburghs in France. The Jedburgh program in France started just several hours, or rather they landed just several hours, parachuted into France right before D-Day. And then for some time thereafter, that program lasted until September. The significance of the Jedburgh program to us is that it was the conduct of unconventional warfare by our people going in and linking up with on-the-ground resistance organizations against our adversary and their occupier. After that, we've got the Cold War. In 1952, the 10th Special Forces Group was set up with a battalion of Bad Tolts, and their mission was stay-behinds. The stay-behind program in Germany and throughout much of Europe was what we will call resistance now, and I'll get to later. They established resistance forces to go ahead and slow down Soviet advances into Europe in case there was a Soviet advance, and to gather and send out intelligence. Okay, the second age. That goes from 61 to 79. The most significant person here is President John F. Kennedy, because under him, excuse me, the special forces had expanded several fold, giving them increased capability during the Vietnam conflict. And over there, I've got the programs of the Civilian Irregular Defense Group that they're involved in MACV. Next slide. Third age, 1980 to 2020. Eagle Claw was the failed attempted rescue of hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Urgent Fury was Grenada. Grenada overall was successful, but it had some soft failures. Based on those two events, we have a major reorganization of the SOF enterprise. And then with legislation, the Nunn-Cohen Amendment to the Goldwater-Nichols Act brought about AST SOLIC and USOCOM in 1987, then followed by USASOC in 1988. Underneath that, we've got several countries that I'm listing because of our involvement. El Salvador and Honduras were foreign internal defense operations that we conducted, which were very successful. In Nicaragua, we conducted coercive UW by supporting the Contra insurgency against the government in Managua. That also played into what we were doing in Honduras and El Salvador. Now, the important part about Nicaragua is that we used UW as a coercive method, not to overthrow, but to coerce the government there. On the bottom over there, I've got a list of mention of an article that I wrote with a friend of mine, Jim Worrell, this past July for the Modern War Institute, looking at unconventional warfare and how it can be applied in the early 20th century. You don't necessarily need guerrillas on the ground to bring about the effects that a guerrilla on the ground would have had 40 to 50 years ago. You could do it today in the information environment in cyberspace. Then we have Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've got counterinsurgency in red simply because we've got serious lessons we still need to learn. Counterinsurgency, I cannot call successful for either Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan should be obvious. Iraq was a bit more complicated. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the present age, the fourth age, which is set up by these documents as our initial framework with a concentration on the IW Annex. Next slide. I lifted this paragraph from the IW document. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in bold, we've got great power competition is our primary present security challenge. We're departing from 20 years of counter VEO operations, and we need to master irregular warfare and sharpen those capabilities against our near-peer competitors today. Next slide. And those two near-peer competitors are Russia and the PRC. And on the top, I've got a link to an article that I wrote In the Special Operations Journal just last month, it's Resistance Resurgent, Resurrecting a Method of Irregular Warfare. So underneath Russia, I've got a list of their actions in approximately the past 15 years. I've got a question mark by the Suwalki Gap because it's likely that Putin wants the Suwalki Gap in order to unite the Oblast of Kaliningrad with Russia through Belarus, but he hasn't outright stated that. Against the PRC, we've got several actions that they undertook. They imposed a national security law in Macau in 2009, violating their basic law, the same thing that they did in Hong Kong in 2020. And in the South China Sea, they've got the 9-dash line and they claim some blue national soil. Our response to Russia has been the European Defense Initiative, I think begun in about 2017. And then in the Pacific, we've got the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is very new. And I believe it came about just last year. Next slide. Just a week ago, the Congressional Research Service published their renewed Great Power Competition and Assessment. So what we looked at, and I just draw out several bullets from this study, even though the study is much broader. Each of these powers is nuclear capable, which means that conflict can be extraordinarily dangerous. The study also went on to note that the deployments of our forces, NATO forces, allies, and partners are not exactly where they need to be and what they need to be in order to deter those adversaries from further incursions, from perhaps preventing Putin from going to the Suwalki Gap or doing much about Taiwan or the South China Sea against the PRC. The last bullet is mine. We lack a significant US and allied conventional force displacement along this certain periphery of those adversary powers. Next slide. And that brings us to what we can do. Resistance and resilience. Prior to this present job, I was glad to be in SOCUR and part of putting together the resistance operating concept. The Swedish Defense University published it in December 2019 and followed several months later by JSOU. And I drew out two definitions, and these are the primary definitions that I'm operating with. Resistance is an organized whole of society effort ranging from nonviolent to nonviolent, and it's legally established. It's basically owned by the government, just like the military is owned by the government. Resilience is the foundation. Resilience is withstanding or recovering from external pressure. Next slide. These are elements of resistance. A resistance organization has to be established by the legitimate sovereign government in a pre-crisis environment. It supports a whole of society effort of resistance against an occupier. The methods are nonviolent to violent. The nonviolent actors are primarily your whole of society people outside of the resistance organization. Your violent actors are those people inside the organization. And that organization should be treated like any other military organization, and it seeks to be legitimate by operating under the law of armed conflict in accordance with the Geneva Conventions of '49 and the Hague Regulations of 1907, which I won't get into here. Next slide. The features. It needs to be prepared pre-crisis, and it has the typical components of underground auxiliary guerrilla and the critical component of the government in exile, which is absolutely necessary in order to maintain national sovereignty. It has to have legal and policy frameworks. So it needs to be authorized and established and run by the government. It's only to be used against the occupier. And this is critical to understand because if you look at the Cold War and what happened with Gladio, which was the Italian state behind operation, those entities did not have adequate legal and policy frameworks. Some of those entities were used against internal political opposition. In Italy, they were probably used against internal communists. Early on, they were used against potential Yugoslavian espionage up near the border. And so this should not be an internal security force or a police force of any type or an intelligence force. Nations have entities that do that for them. This type of resistance is an organized resistance that you use only against an occupier. And the next bullet is supports the whole of society. And the second portion under the whole of society, I've got disaster relief. Any sort of incursion will look like a man-made disaster. And so your disaster response operations are part of your resiliency. They also give you the opportunity of certain sub rosa activities. A guiding narrative in case of invasion can be established now. And then the last bullet, this needs to be understood as a form of warfare. It is part of a national defense and part of a form of warfare to be conducted against an occupier. And it is a legitimate form of warfare and retains that legitimacy as long as it's connected to a exiled government that's legitimate. And the foundation of all this is resilience. Next slide. Elements of resilience. Resilience involves many elements. One of them is a nation conceiving itself as a nation of people. So this has to do with patriotism and being united as a nation. People need to be aware of adversary operations, and the Baltics are doing a very good job of making their citizens aware of adversary operations by Russia. And the third bullet, common political goal, D-1, telling everyone that no matter what happens, we should reset to before the occupier invaded the territory, before our territorial integrity was lost. That's probably what you'll get most people to unite behind, rather than something new, the creation of something new, or saying that the nation failed. Uniting people behind getting back to D-1 before the adversary came in is probably the most unifying political goal. Domestic vulnerabilities. On a domestic vulnerability that's very common is the ethnic population of your adversary. Latvia and Estonia have that difficulty because they have significant Russian populations, but they're not all going to be people who want to unite with Mother Russia. But within them are vulnerabilities. Down at the bottom, I've got a schematic there to demonstrate how I think about this, which is the nation is the people, the term state is the administrative bureaucratic organs, and the government is those who are elected to run the state. Next slide. Okay, the features of resilience. Strong national identification. I mentioned that already. Popular and government resistance preparation. Individuals can prepare, organizations can prepare. Strategic communication. The message in pre-conflict is deterrence. The message under occupation is denial. You want to deny political consolidation to the adversary. And then we have the audiences. The audiences are the adversary government and its population. Within that population, if there is another political party, then that political party can be messaged to leverage it against the governing authority. The internal population of the nation that is under occupation is also a receiver of the message. Their morale has to be maintained in order to maintain their resilience. And then messages for the allies and partners, because an ally or partner such as the United States has a population which has to support its government in what it does. So messaging the population within the United States or other allies and partners to retain their support of the government is critical as that government helps the exiled government and the people under occupation. Next slide. All right, these are two schematics. There's a dashed line there dividing them. The top one is one of the original ones from one of the original conferences regarding resistance over in Europe. On the left, you'll see resilience, and resilience is built in peacetime. Then you see the dividing line of loss of sovereignty, and on the right, you see resistance. So after loss of sovereignty, the nation partakes in resistance. On the bottom is another schematic that we have in the ROC, which talks about this even further. I'm not going to go into the details, but I'll note two major things. The foundation is resilience. The foundation prior, during, and after is resilience. That big arrow in the center is crisis to conflict. After that occurs, the resilience organization fights the occupier. The people can also resist, but there should be just one resilient resistance organization, rather, owned by the government and operating against the occupier. Next slide. Operations and principles. The resistance operations need to focus on popular morale. A resistance organization is probably going to partake in activities simply to let the people know that they're around, that they're operating on their behalf, in their favor, and against the occupier. Other targets are those that can be done in cooperation with Allied and NATO forces. And we can look at that, look at the Jedburghs of World War II for our primary lesson. As I said, the Jedburghs in World War II were involved in slowing down the German response to the Normandy invasion. The same thing can be set up and planned for now with allies and partners. Also, throughout the time of this resistance organization under occupation, they should also be gathering and sending out information to be turned into intelligence for the use of its allies and partners. The principles of resistance, national identity, the maintenance of legitimacy, and strong allies and partners. Based on the research that we found, resistance organization will not succeed unless it has a strong external ally or partner. In adherence to the law of armed conflict, the organization has to adhere to the law of armed conflict and conduct itself as any other military organization. Thanks very much for your attention, and Scott will handle the questions and answer session afterwards.
And Otto, thank you so much for your remarks. And as we all are watching the events on the border of Ukraine and Russia, thinking about the concepts that you described and trying to put all this in a broader geostrategic lens and fashion, your remarks were extremely helpful and deeply resonated. So thank you again for being here with us today. I'd like to now turn the floor over to my good friend and former colleague, Dr. Liam Collins. Liam?
Hey, thanks, Scott. Yeah, so from 2016 to 2018, I moonlighted as General Abizade's executive officer when he was appointed as the Senior Defense Advisor to Ukraine. So I spent a lot of time over there between 2016 and 2018, over there meeting with everybody from their president, minister of defense, chief of defense, parliamentarians, down the line, and then back in the U.S. on the policy side with the senior Department of State officials, Secretary Mattis, General McMaster, House Armed Services Committee. So a lot of time kind of looking at this problem and thinking about it. Go ahead and, yeah, you got the slides up there. And so I'll kind of come at it from a little different perspective there. And if we want to have a strategic direction of how we should, organize, train, and employ our force, or special operations forces, we should understand the strategic objectives of our competitors. And I would argue we don't always do a good job at understanding their strategic objectives and capabilities. And even when we do, it rarely translates into organizing, training, and employing an appropriate force for two primary reasons. One I call organizational entropy, right? Kind of resistance to change or kind of go in the direction or how the organization is formed. And the second is the military industrial complex. Next slide. So we have to understand what we're trying to resist. Go back one. I think we skipped one. So again, I would look at Russia here. Russian hybrid war, right? It's nothing new. We all know this, right? It's been, it's similar to what we did during our own Revolutionary War. Russia's trying to operate below the threshold of war. They view it as a low risk, low cost, high reward strategy. For example, right? The cost of propping up the economies of Georgia's South Ossetia or Abkhazia, relatively low cost if it accomplishes their strategic objective of preventing Georgia from joining NATO or the EU. Versus, right, how much are we spending for the enhanced forward presence mission in Eastern Europe that arguably does absolutely nothing to deter Russia. And so we must understand what Russia's strategic objectives are, right? And so typically, right, the seizure of territory that we saw in Crimea, right, that's the exception, right? This was, strategic territory, I would argue. And Crimea had a special history with Russia, right? It was only Khrushchev transferred it to Ukraine in 1954 as a ceremonial act intended to mark 3 centuries of union between Russia and Ukraine. And shortly after the wall came down, they tried to, right, they started that time trying to pull Crimea back to Russia. And so that's a unique thing, right? More often than not, it's going to have to do with control, what we see in Georgia or Ukraine. When I talk Ukraine here, I'm talking the Donbass in the east. Right, and again, to accomplish their strategic objective of preventing their either nation from joining NATO or the EU, or right, influence in Europe. Right, this is right undermining our democratic values, information operations, and their primary effort is typically political subversion. Then I kind of tee up that question on the bottom: are we in a period similar in some ways to the Cold War? Right, largely an informational war. Are we going to have, punctuated by periods of lethal conflict, which remember during the Cold War, right, a good number of those were predominantly fought by proxies. And so that's probably a good indicator of how things might be going forward. I've argued before that, we use the term that we're in a period of great power competition. And I argue we're not in a period of great power competition. We're in a period of great power conflict. We just don't realize it because we view conflict as something that has to be legal. But our competitors, right, or our adversaries don't view it that way, right? For them, it is a conflict, right? They don't have this hard line between peace and war, right? Russia doesn't draw this dichotomy. And so for Russia, it's not about defeating us militarily. It's about weakening us politically and economically, right? Or our allies. Right, so we see with such as impeding commercial boating traffic in the Kerch Strait that goes into the Sea of Azov, right? So it's cost shipping captains $15,000 to $20,000 per day, which then discourages trade to Mariupol and eastern Ukraine, right? So this is the conflict that we're in now. Again, largely an informational conflict. Likewise for China, right? It's not about defeating us militarily. It's about weakening us economically, stealing our intellectual property, and these things. And people forget, I think, oftentimes that the Cold War was won just as much from the battle of ideas, right? Convincing people that the liberal democracy and capitalism is a superior political economic system to communism, and that's being undermined right now. And so, looking at the conflict we're in, are we over-investing, or are we investing in the right systems and employing them in the most efficient way for the type of conflict that we actually see ourselves in? Next slide. So I just put this up, right? It's just a way to kind of view Russia's capabilities, right? It could be China or whoever, right? But the first, you can kind of lump them into political warfare and cyber espionage, right? These are things that they're doing all the time. But then they also have, if they want to turn lethal or kinetic, right? They have these other capabilities they can draw, as well as to pull in those capabilities that they use kind of throughout this period of conflict. Next slide. And again, in Ukraine, they were, using that as an exceptional testing ground for many of those capabilities. I put up this slide here, right? What this chart is to show, okay, what chance does a small nation like a Baltic nation or Georgia have to deter Russia, right? When their military expenditure is 2% or less of than what Russia's is, right? So kind of go back to first they have a choice: do they want to balance with Russia or balance against Russia or bandwagon with them? Right, Belarus is kind of the lone exception that's chosen to bandwagon with Russia. Not a great strategy. So the rest are seeking to balance against Russia, right? Either through internal means, right, through military means, or external through alliances, or a combination of both. And so the Baltics, they're part of NATO, and this is why Georgia and Ukraine, right, were left without any allies. This is why they're trying so hard to join NATO, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. But it doesn't mean that, that they're just left to do whatever Russia pleases with them. And so small nations, right? They don't have to defeat Russia. They only have to deter Russia, right? And Putin's extremely calculated and rational with how he goes about and does what he does. And so really the key is communicating to Russia. Go to the next slide, right? And so the key is communicating to Putin that, studies have shown to get any Baltic nation within a week and be in the capital. But you want to communicate to Putin that, an invasion would be costly, right? So increase the cost to Russia, and then ultimately convince him that, that it would be, if he does go and take a Baltic nation, it's not going to be Crimea where they're just going to keep it. It's going to be the U.S. experience in Vietnam. It's going to be Russia's in Afghanistan in the 80s. Right, it's not going to be the Baltics during the Cold War, right? That is going to face resistance throughout an occupation, and therefore, he makes the rational decision. It's not worth the invasion in the first place because I know how this is going to play out, and therefore, we're not going to invade in the first place. So that's kind of convincing him of the resistance that the cost is too much and it's not worth it, right? So you think about these nations, and the Baltics have done a pretty good job of divesting from expensive weapon platforms, right? Tanks, aircraft, these expensive weapons that the Russians could identify and take them out before conflict started, and reinvesting in other capabilities. And you think about, I remember from a conference we had 3 or 4 years ago, we had a senior officer from Army's Futures Command, and he was talking about all these things we were going to be investing in, as we kind of look to the future. And so I asked them, okay, so what are we divesting from? And the scary thing was that not that he didn't have an answer, but that he hadn't even thought about the question before, right? And so it's a matter of, okay, if you're going to invest in something, you have to divest from something. But for Russia, right, it's increasing, right, air defense capabilities, right, anti-tank weapon systems, right? These things are going to increase the cost of Russia before they come in. And then once they're in, if they're occupying, right, if you got a Stinger missile or a Javelin system in the trunk of your car, right, it's very hard for them to find. And then really, right, a reserves or a porcupine strategy, right? This is kind of the civil resistance. And again, it doesn't work too well in a place like Ukraine because they don't necessarily want to arm their population. Where it works better in the Baltics. And then the other piece of that, right, decrease Russian effectiveness, right, cyber defense, make it become less vulnerable. And another story, again, a few years ago, we were visiting Georgia's National Security Administration, and they, were like, okay, where should we put our cell phones? And they're like, no, you can keep them with you. And I'm like, okay, so we've learned nothing. And I won't talk about this long. I will save time for question and answer. I just kind of put this up here again, right? If you think we're in a period of, I argue conflict, even if it's not a war like the Cold War, it's still useful to think of some of those characteristics of the Cold War, right? The battle of ideas, right? As Gerasimov has said, right? Special operations force, internal operations, and information operations can create a permanently operating front throughout the entire territory of the enemy state. Right, or also, right, proxy wars, what we saw a lot during that time too. And so I'm not going to talk about information operations here. We could save for question and answer. But, again, just kind of tee this up is, if we're going to, proxy wars were in the past, that, I think those are going to be something we're going to have in the future. And so let's be smart in thinking about how we can do those effectively. And this table is a draft from a draft that we're working on for a chapter on proxy war. And just kind of, thinking about some of the characteristics. And, I'll just hit up one, something, for example, right, like the advisory effort should be kept small, painfully small. Okay, maybe not at the 55-person limit that we had in El Salvador, but SOF, just like the rest of the Army, right? We want to grow. We don't know when to hold back. Right. And the logic is often simple, right? The less you have, the more reliant you are on developing the host nation force capability, rather than trying to do it yourself. And kind of, related to that, the larger force you have in a nation, you try to fix everything instead of just fixing the things you absolutely must. So I'll kind of end it there, and then so we got time for questions and answers later.
All right, Liam, thank you very much for your comments. And just like Otto, so many essential and salient points for the current and emergent strategic environment. And we thank you again for joining us. I'd like to now hand the floor off to Master Chief Boehmer. Master Chief, thank you again for being with us this morning. Over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. I did not build any slides for my discussion. However, I used the framing questions that you provided to focus my talking points. I don't think anything I'm going to say will be earth-shattering or a new concept, but I do believe it'll link into the comments made by my colleagues. But as I look at SOF support to resilience and resistance in the current environment, and more importantly, the future strategic environment, there are a few historical aspects of SOF knowledge, skills, and attributes that I think are relevant yesterday as they will be in the future. A few things I have observed over my career are: one, the SOF's ability to operate in a small, persistently forward deployed team; two, the language, regional, cultural understanding within the team; three, that core capabilities within that team; and four, the combat credibility of that team, sometimes recent and relevant. These KSAs provide the trust and credibility that our partners are looking for. As we all say, trust can't be surged, and by working with our partners over years, we reinforce that trust. Some would say that we have focused on direct action for the past 20 plus years, and I understand that perspective. But I would challenge the fact is we have had small teams, small SOF teams that have continued to engage globally throughout the GWAT. I would say SOF has continued to conduct its core activities both inside and outside the combat zone. What I have seen during the last 5 years in the Indo-PACOM AOR that I think is relevant to this discussion is the applicability of those KSAs and those tactics, techniques, and procedures that we learned and developed in support of the VEO mission set. U.S. SOF combat credible reputation can be an opportunity in the future operating environment and in support of potential resilient and resistant operations. What was interesting to me was our partners' interest and desire to work with US SOF because of that combat experience. These countries can't change their zip code, as we've said before, but what they don't talk openly about Russia or China as an example, but they will absolutely talk to us about security issues or challenges that they have within their sovereignty. This leads to requests for SOF training or SOF equipment, or even more importantly, help support FMS and IMET cases, which I am a big fan of. These opportunities, if properly coordinated and synchronized, has the potential to create the positional and informational advantage for the joint force because of that SOF access and placement. A quick example I would give is from my last tour is how the Philippines had the opportunity to buy either Hind helicopters or Black Hawk helicopters. They ended up purchasing Black Hawks. I'm sure there were a lot of factors that led into that decision, but I would challenge that the longstanding US relationship with a key partner at a key location helped drive that decision, which to me goes back to my comments earlier about the trust and credibility. As SOF goes forward, I think we have to ask how much of the VEO capacity do we need to maintain for the future? Is there a level of acceptable risk to the VEO capacity that we can be used for future trade-off to build these new capabilities? I don't think we can maintain our current capacity as we look at the future operating environment. There must be a divestment of something to invest in these future capabilities. I think we need to look at everything from our organizational structure to our skill sets to our material items. As we look to supporting and shaping the environment that promotes the rules-based international order, I see opportunity for SOF's role with space, cyber, and information as it supports resilience and resistance. I think it is important for SOF to look at how we incorporate these domains when looking at that future operating environment to allow us to operate below the level of armed conflict. But what does that mean? Is it an integrated capability or is it an organic capability within the team? How much of that capacity of that capability do we need? This could lead to changes in our manning, our training, and our equipment, which will need to be resourced. I don't know exactly what the future will hold, but I do know that we will have to look at our future structure and organization to create these trade-offs to develop future capabilities at the right level of capacity. This will require us to look at our future design and our future force development. The last few things I would discuss are SOF components, training models, and readiness. The future operating environment may force us to go back to our SOF service roots. Example, putting the SEALs back into the water, which I know the components are already looking at that. My point is that we all can't focus on that direct action operation anymore. I think it is important because as we develop the new capacity and capabilities to operate in the gray zone, we may have the potential to change our training models, which will change our readiness. Finally, some hard decisions will have to be made for this future operating environment, and I think we're laying that foundation to support those challenges through forums like this. Thank you.
Master Chief, thank you very, very much again for your great comments and your ideas that espoused for the forum. I'm just taking a look real quick at the Q&A line before we move forward. A question that we have from the audience, and I'll leave this open for any of you gentlemen, is how SOF should support resistance. Is special operations properly organized and equipped to enable modern resistance forces? And I'll let you think about that for a second. I thank you from Dr. Sandor Fabian asking that question. So I'll pause there. Over to the panelists.
Scott, I think SOF, basically Army Special Forces primarily, are suited to support resistance. They were initially designed to do that very purpose. And as I mentioned with the 10th group, the originals, and the resistance organizations of the stay-behinds during the Cold War, that is an integral part of the SF mission. So our special forces are very capable of supporting the establishment of resistance organizations overseas. Civil affairs and PSYOPs also have a role to play, but we have what we need to help other countries set up actual resistance, authorized resistance organizations in support of their governments.
Yeah, and Scott, I mean, like I talked about before, I mean, I think our focus should be on preventing, right, making it so they don't ever have to resist, right? Giving that capability in advance, communicating with Russia, right? This is what we see the Lithuanians producing manuals on what to do if the Russians invade, right? Making it a national law in their constitution, right? They have to resist against the Russians if they come in, right? Communicating, and it's large part information operations, right? That it's just not worth it. So you never have to get to the resistance point, but you have to build that capability so it's communicated.
Slam. Master Chief.
Hey, sir, I would agree. I think RSOF is absolutely suited for the UW mission. However, I think as we look to the future, I think there's opportunities to expand the capabilities within the UW formation as going forward. When we start looking at technology, is there ways to actually support resilience and resistance remotely? I think that's things we have to look at, and how do we train an operator to be able to provide that kind of support in the future. So those are things I think, we have the foundations, but as we look at going forward, I think there's an evolution as we look at the digital world. Over.
Thanks, Master Chief. No, that's great feedback. And I think it ties into one of the driving imperatives that both SOCOM and JSOU is routinely thinking about is what does joint SOF mean going forward in the future? And how do we synergize things from a component level to bring something that's truly comprehensive that gets us to kind of deliver that strategic effect? And to Liam's point and to Otto's point, I'm glad that we're already talking about issues of deterrence. Right after this panel, we're going to hear from Lieutenant General Fletcher, the head of NATO SOF, and we're ending this forum tomorrow on this concept of integrated deterrence and what role does SOF play in that. So I really appreciate all of your feedback and comments. I think we have time for maybe one more question. This question comes from Chris Hopkins, and the question is, how does special operations improve resilience and resistance within countries who may not overtly acknowledge an external threat? And again, I think this is very timely because I think what we've seen over the last few years, some countries acknowledge challenges, but are hesitant to formally name countries or name threats in an overt sense. Over to the panel.
Well, Scott, I think for those countries, if they decide to establish a resistance organization similar to what we outlined in the ROC, that resistance organization would simply not be publicized the way the Baltics have publicized it, the way the Swedes have publicized resistance. And so that would be a much more clandestine organization. Otherwise, there are also things that they can do openly, which is increase their resiliency. And increasing their resiliency has to do with their disaster response organizations, increasing the sense of nationhood, patriotism, and keeping the nation together as a nation, seeing themselves as a nation and wanting to maintain themselves as a nation. That gets very political, but that's part of what needs to be done.
No, Otto, thanks. And coming back to this idea of nation and citizen and reinforcing positivist aims, all this coming at a time when we're dealing with a democratic deficit, a democracy deficit across the world right now, and seeing that kind of correlation with subversive behavior coming from our adversaries and competitors, all related. Liam and Master Chief, any final thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is, didn't really get into it here, but, do we need to create SOF, information operations or cyber operators, right? I mean, those we rely on, people coming in and out of SOF to kind of do that mission, but is that a capability that we need to, invest more into, as a SOF capability?
Thanks, Master Chief.
Hey, sir, that's actually the point I was going to kind of dovetail into, sir. I appreciate it. I think it's how we look at the human domain and what opportunities SOF could provide in that. And I do see that from the cyber and the information domain. And I know that's what we're working through in the DoD. What is information? How do we influence it? How do we shape it? Those are things in the future that don't require us to put actual boots on the ground someplace, but we can help shape for the future. But I think those are opportunities in the future we should be looking at. Absolutely.
Great. Well, we've got time for one last question. And I think this is a good one because it puts us in the context of how we started to discuss this issue of security cooperation, foreign military sales, and this issue of what do you invest in, what do you divest in? And the question comes from Mr. Glenn Juman. And his question is, what type of security cooperation and assistance objectives are required to build a resilience and resistance capability and capacity in a host nation, ally, or partner. Thanks.
Hey, sir, I'll take a stab at that real quick. Just coming out of the Indo-PACOM AOR, the example I would talk about quickly is our relationship with the Maldives. As an example, in my last visit there, I was very amazed at the number of personnel from the Minister of Defense on down that had received U.S. training at some point in time in their career, which I think helped set the conditions to create that relationship in that country. So as I said in my portion, hey, the IMET program, I'm a huge fan of it because that lays the foundation well left of bang over the long term. And if we could expand that program, I would encourage us to look at how we actually could potentially expand that program because it helps us in the future environment. Over.
Thanks, Master Chief. No, that's a great point, and something that I've heard referred to in the past is when it comes to asking a country to determine whether or not the United States is the partner of choice. Many times it's the governance and military and economic elites who make those decisions and not necessarily the average citizen of a country. So investing in those relationships now have a high payoff later. So, well, gentlemen, I on behalf of the Joint Special Operations University, we really significantly and greatly appreciate your time in support of not only the panel, but today's forum. I believe we're going to segue now over to a very, very short break and get ready for our keynote address. So gentlemen, again, thank you all very, very much. And you and your families have a great holiday season. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott.